attached, and a lot of it was from the New York Republican Party. And at the time, the two great power bases of the Republican Party were Ohio and New York. And although Grant had been born in Ohio, the Grants were really associated with the New York crowd. His successor was Rutherford B. Hayes, the governor. And you couldn't have found two radically different women than Lucy Hayes and Julia Grant. In fact, on Inauguration Day, one reporter sitting watching Mrs. Hayes as the ceremony is going on gave a very detailed pen description, and it just broke into rhapsody to the point that she described her as looking like the Virgin Mary. And talking about her hairstyle as evokes the Madonna herself, and people got very tired of that very quickly. There were a lot of newspaper and public reaction to Mrs. Hayes, who was a devout Methodist and banned alcohol from the White House, and would have Sunday hymn singing, and people really started criticizing her for that it wasn't a very social house. And this is an era when you see morality, when you see the clothing of first ladies really taking on questions of morality. And that really culminates with Frances Cleveland, the 21-year-old woman who was a bride in the White House and who liked to wear very low-cut dresses and bare her arms. And she was the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had really been fans of Lucy Hayes and donated Mrs. Hayes' portrait to the White House, where there's a water jug coming out because she only served water and soft drinks. They went after Mrs. Cleveland and petitioned her and said she was setting an immoral example for the young women of the country. And Mrs. Cleveland just kept wearing the low-cut dresses. But you are, again, looking at what else is going on. The technology. Finally, photographs can now be reproduced in magazines on the finer linen paper. And just a few years later, 1901, you see Ida McKinley, who succeeded Mrs. Cleveland. Very fuzzy image, but it's the first known photograph of her in a newspaper. Simultaneous to that are you start to see the Mrs. McKinley captured on film. She's the very first lady who is seen in the very early motion pictures, moving pictures as they called them. And that really begins to affect and accelerate the public interest in what first ladies are wearing. Jumping ahead a little bit then, you come, say, to the 1920s and the important benchmark of women gaining the right to vote. And Mrs. Harding is in the White House. Now, Mrs. Harding is one of the oldest women to become First Lady, but in spirit, she captures the Roaring Twenties. She's the first to fly in an airplane. She is fascinated by the movie camera. She has the first radio in the White House. She invites movie stars to the White House. She does public appearances. She's an advocate, a radical advocate for animal protection, in fact, coming out even against vivisection, 1921. She is also an outspoken suffragist, and she begins to wear clothing, although it's appropriate for her, it's a stylized version of what young women are wearing at the time. The very early beginnings of what later became thought of as the flapper look. Mrs. Harding hired the first named designer, a man by the name of Harry Collins, and he was a theatrical costume designer. And so she wore his clothes, and it really attracted a lot of attention. She, again, like Mrs. Grant said when she was asked about how short women should dress and how short young girls should be allowed to dress, she said, I'm going to leave that to the wisdom of the individual to make that decision. She had a bit of she was a little bit self-conscious about her neck, and so she would wear a black velvet neck collar and put a diamond sunburst there to sort of, I suppose, either bring attention to the diamond or attention away from her neck, but in a way to try and sort of, appear younger. And the irony of it is that became popular with young women at the time, and that was called a Flossie Kling. Now, her maiden name had been Kling, and her name was Florence, so they started calling those Flossie Klings, and they became popular. Her immediate successor, Grace Coolidge, is really fascinating when it comes to this subject, because we think of the Coolidges as they were very parsimonious Yankees from Vermont. They had a farm, and the president worked on the farm, and it was his family farm. Mrs. Coolidge, was famous for, her blueberry muffin recipe, and she was very domestic, and yet she was also college educated and worked as a teacher of the deaf, and was a real advocate for women seeking full education, and yet when you begin to see what she dressed in, they were extravagant, and they were really stylish, and I think in many ways she's the first lady, in some ways a modern first lady, in the sense that she reminded me almost a little bit of Michelle Obama, in that she was very aware of what was in vogue, and very and updated her wardrobe, all the time. In fact, during an interview I had once with Betty Ford, Mrs. Ford told me that as a young girl, she remembered how important Mrs. Coolidge had been to her mother in dictating. At one time, people would look to first ladies during the 20s and 30s for a sense of what was the right style, to sort of be appropriate and proper, and yet at the same time stylish. And I should also mention that, of course, Mrs. Coolidge becomes the first lady whose voice we hear. So now we've seen, Mrs. Wilson during World War I, Mrs. Harding and Mrs. Coolidge in the 20s, and what they're wearing in newsreels, in movie houses. Mrs. Hoover we hear on the radio, and every Sunday the nation hears Eleanor Roosevelt on the radio. And the nation not only hears Mrs. Roosevelt, but a lot of the nation actually saw Mrs. Roosevelt. She was very rarely at the White House. She was constantly on the move. This during the Great Depression, and of course she assumed famously the role of eyes and ears of the president. And she saw an opportunity when World War II, when the war broke out in Europe, an opportunity for American manufacturing, American fashion industry. And she was very much, she was a supporter of the Ladies Garment Union, but she also, for all of her social activism, took enormous pride in the fact that she was named to a best dressed list. When she made these public appearances, of course, around the country, she knew that the public wanted a little touch of elegance. They were expecting it from First Lady. And she was, in trains and planes, drove her own car. So she always brought, except in the hottest winter days, this fur piece. And people later spoke about, that fur piece was, pretty ratty by the time the Roosevelt years ended. But people loved it, and little kids would come up and, want to touch it, and